Hello everyone, you're very welcome along on this latest episode of the Yorkshire Photo Walks podcast with me, Tom, the flat-capped photographer. This is where I head out completely unplanned and unscripted with my camera on photo walks through impressive Yorkshire locations. And along the way I share what I photograph, why I'm photographing it and how I'm photographing it, with I suppose a view to helping you to improve your photography skills, maybe broaden your photography horizons, and maybe even entertain you a little bit along the way as well. Regular listeners to the podcast will know that the photographs are available to view at yorkshirephotowalks.com/podcasts, where you'll find the show notes page to this podcast and all subsequent and previous episodes to the podcast as well. You can also now view the podcasts on YouTube. Just head over to Yorkshire Photo Walks on YouTube and you can not only look at the photographs as I take them, you can also watch me doing the walk. So it's all good stuff. Some cyclists going past there. Look at me, I'm talking in front of people. This is incredible. I've not done this before. Maybe it's this foreign air that's getting to me. If you are watching on YouTube, then you'll realise that the background is definitely not Yorkshire, although if it was, I think it would be quite strange. So today I'm actually in the French Alps. Look at all this behind me. If you're listening to the podcast, obviously you can't see what's behind me, but it's very mountainous and nice and sunny and lots of forests around as well. So hopefully lots on offer to photograph today as we head off on a walk around this lake called Lac de Plange. Apologies for my poor French accent. As I say, this is completely unscripted, so we'll see what comes along the way and see what there is to photograph. But I'm sure that my camera will be very busy today because A, it's a place that I've not been to before, which is always a good sign for taking interesting photographs when you approach things with a fresh eye. And B, it's an absolutely stonking day. The sun's out, the sky's blue, there's a bit of cloud cover, but it's actually very pleasant, which is very rare on these podcasts. Usually I'm heading out and I'm getting rained on and I'm having to put my jacket on because I'm freezing cold. But today, no, it's absolutely fantastic. So join me on this photo walk in the French Alps just for a change of scene because I'm on holiday and I can't think of anything better to do other than talk to you. Call me sad if you want to, but as I always say, if I wasn't recording one of these podcasts whilst I was out and about, I'd just be talking to myself saying the same rubbish anyway. So let's go and have a look around this fantastic place. And hopefully you'll see some interesting and different photographs to normal on the show notes page this time. I suppose when you are somewhere like this, where you're somewhere different that's quite awe-inspiring and not what you're used to, I think it pays just to take a step back or two, because I often find that you can get A, snap happy and take lots of photographs that you have to edit afterwards, and B, you can just lose yourself a little bit and think, what on earth do I photograph here, because everything's so impressive. So I think the first thing that I usually do in places like this is that I ask myself, what is it that I want to photograph? I know that might seem an absolutely stupid question because, well, you're photographing this impressive landscape around you, aren't you? But sometimes if you think, right, I'm a landscape photographer, therefore I need to photograph the landscape in all of its glory and get absolutely everything in and pack everything into the photograph and make sure that it's perfectly lit, and you're just going to put too much pressure on yourself. I'm on holiday, I want to enjoy this experience, and hopefully I want you to enjoy it as well, rather than listening to me stress that I'm not getting the photographs that I want. So I think it's really important that we just take a step back at the beginning of this podcast and think, actually, what is it that I want to photograph here today? So in answer to that question, what is it that I want to photograph? Well, I do want to photograph things that interest me and things that pop out. That sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? But I think things that just grab my attention rather than trying to make photographs of things that I might like the look of, but in terms of a photograph might not work. So the first thing that I've seen is this scene behind me here, which is a little bend in the path with the trees in the shade behind it and the trees on the bend in the light. And I think it might just work as an interesting first photograph of my photo walk today. I like the path disappearing at one side, and I like the path at the other side disappearing around the corner. It gives a nice vanishing point. So when you don't have a focal point to draw the eye in your photograph, then it really does help to have something that leads the eye to some kind of intrigue, and a vanishing point is a perfect way of doing that. And that's exactly what I've got in front of me here. So we've got the line of the edge of the lake as a leading line. I've got the path in front of me as a leading line as well, which is all strongly leading towards that vanishing point in the middle where the path goes round the corner. Now I might try two shots here, with one shot with the path leading off to the right and one shot without that, just with the strong lead of the line of the lake. Because I have a feeling that if I took the photograph of the one with the path on the right hand side, then that might have the effect of leading your eye away and out towards the right of the photograph, where realistically I want people's eye to circulate around the middle of the frame. So I think the shot with the path just disappearing in the middle might work a little bit better. It might be actually worth trying a portrait shot of this as well, because we've got some interesting little bit of foreground interest with some foliage along the bank of the lake. And yeah, let's just give it a go. I'll show all of the photographs that I take here on the show notes page. And if you're watching on YouTube, then please comment in the comment section below to tell me which one you think is better. And if you agree with me that the one with the path just vanishing in the middle works the best, if you disagree, then please feel free to. And if you're listening to the podcast, then, as I say, head over to the show notes page at yorkshirephotowalks.com/podcasts, where you can have a little longer look at the photographs and mull it over. Before I got waylaid by that disappearing path shot, I was asking myself, what sort of photographs do I want to take today? And I sort of mentioned that I don't want it to be that sort of classic landscape, because if I go for that on a day like today, where the sun's as bright as it can possibly be, and all of the colours are looking a bit washed out and uninspiring and very green, which is not one of my favourite colours in photography, I have to admit, then I have to sort of diversify a little bit and not get overwhelmed by the impressive nature of the landscape, but think, how can I translate that into photographs? And a little bit like that disappearing path shot, I want to find things that show off a sense of scale of the landscape, but also show off my walk as a bit of a documentary, really, rather than this is a photograph of this is a photograph of that, this is a photograph of another thing. I want these photographs to almost flow a little bit, so that they follow on from each other. So not only when you look at the photographs on the show notes page or on YouTube, if you're watching on there, and you think, well, oh yeah, he's got a nice series of landscape photographs there. I want you to almost experience my walk with me and be led by my eye of what it's observed and what I've seen. And I think landscape photographs are brilliant. They have their place and people put them on their walls and they look absolutely perfect and spectacular. But you're very limited to the time of year, the time of day, the sort of lighting that's available to you to make photographs like that. So I think photography a lot of the time is about compromise. It's about looking for things that interest us as individuals, rather than thinking, oh, will somebody buy this, or will this look good on somebody's wall? And if we completely change our perspective on how we're photographing things and why we're photographing things, then I think it can be really beneficial, because it frees us to be ourselves behind the camera, and it frees us to observe things that we might not see if we're always going for that classic shot. There we go, I've found a waterfall. I think this is a perfect example of what I've just been talking about. People think, oh, waterfalls, absolutely spectacular, I want to photograph that. And I want to photograph that view beyond as well, where the water's crashing into the lake. But actually, when you look at it, it's very pretty on the eye, but because half of the waterfall's in shade and half of it's in sun, you can't really get a decent angle on it. Everything's, like I said, very green, and the green sort of overtakes everything else in the frame. So it's not really a photograph in my view. It's very pretty to look at, but I'm going to move on because, again, I don't think this is not very photogenic. That sounds a bit weird, doesn't it? Because you think if something's pretty, then obviously it's photogenic. But sometimes things that are pretty to the eye just don't work in photographs. You've just got to admire it and move on and be strong in making that decision for yourself. I don't know about you, but all of that running and trickling water that is starting to babble off the mountains beside me is making me quite desperate for the toilet. In fact, there's some intriguing looking woods up there, so I might deviate from this main path ever so quickly and go and pay them a visit. Don't worry, if you're watching on YouTube, I'm not going to record that bit. That's better. I've decided to follow this path that I wandered up because it was intriguing me with all the pine trees that are surrounding me. And it just gives a different perspective on the landscape rather than just looking at the lake all the time. Again, I think that's really important to do. If there's some really strong focal points that you think, I must be photographing this because it's big and it's in my face and it's screaming to be photographed, then sometimes it pays just to deviate from that a little bit and think, actually, what else can I find in this landscape? Because it isn't just all about the big vistas and the lake. Yes, I'll probably take 1 or 2 shots of that because I'm a tourist and that's what tourists do. But I think sometimes just going with the flow a little bit and not putting pressure on yourself to get the shot, which I think I've probably reiterated far too many times in this podcast so far. I don't know how long we're in yet, but I think I've been banging that drum a little bit too much. So I'll keep meandering my way on up this path and see what else I can find to photograph. I've just popped out in this lovely little woodland clearing. Maybe I should stop talking about popping out, especially when I've just visited the bushes. My eye's been drawn to the little area of wildflowers in front of me here. There's a few orchids poking themselves up from the ground in amongst some other flowers that if I was more prepared for this podcast, then I'd probably be able to tell you the names of them. But as I say, this is completely unplanned and unscripted, so I'm just going with the flow here. Now, I've got this one particular orchid in mind because it's standing up pretty much prouder than the others. And it's got beautiful patination on the flowers. The only thing is that there's a little, I don't know what it is really, it looks like an electric fence, but I don't think it's electrified. I'm not going to touch it and find out. I'm going to keep my distance, but maybe if I get down low, which is always a good thing in photography, getting down low, especially when you're photographing flowers. I think if you imagine that the flowers have eyes and photograph them on eye level, that gives you the sort of perspective that you're looking for. Apologies if you're watching this on YouTube because I'm just ranting on to myself whilst you're probably getting a bit seasick from the movement of my camera. So with this orchid, what I'm aiming to do is get on its eye level, like I've just said, and try and integrate some of the colour of the flowers in the background. So shallowing my depth of field down, probably as wide as it will go, which on my camera is f3.5 at its widest point. Sometimes when people photograph flowers like this, they think, I must zoom in because I want to compress the flower into that sort of pocket of focal plane. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach it with my lens wide open in terms of aperture and in terms of its focal length as well, because I think that will just bring in a little bit more of the atmosphere of the surroundings rather than it just being tight to this flower, because I want to get the atmosphere of this woodland clearing in because I think it's absolutely beautiful. The other thing that I'm going to try and do as well is isolate it against the shade in the background, which is engulfing the trees. And by doing that, it will hopefully make the flower pop even more because that's in the sun. And if it's got a darker background, then your eyes are going to be drawn further forward in the shot. So that's my intention. Let's give it a go and see what the photograph comes out like. Those of you that are regular listeners to this podcast will know that I'm not really a big fan of compositional rules in photography. Yes, they're a great place to start, and they help beginners to get away from photographing just random things in random order. But I think sometimes the best rule in photography is that we should break these rules, just use them as guidelines rather than saying we must follow them with every shot. And I have to say, with that shot that I've just taken of the orchid, that I used the rule of thirds. So there we go. I'm going to eat my words once again, as I do many times on these podcasts, don't I? But the rule of thirds, I think, worked with that shot simply because the orchid was being framed by the little, it wasn't a valley, what was it? It was a little cutting in the trees. So I was sort of trying to balance it off in the composition by placing the orchid on the left-hand side and then having the little cutting in the trees at the top right, just so all of the lines within the photograph just arrowed your eye back down towards where I wanted it to be led to, which was the orchid and the atmosphere of that woodland clearing in the sun. I think I've got around that one, haven't I? I've used the rule of thirds, but I've explained why rules aren't that good in photography whilst using the rules. Interesting. It's like being back in Yorkshire. I've found a patch of boggy mud on the path. The French do like to make you feel at home, don't they? I've just spotted a house on the hillside in front of me. It's got a rusting iron roof and it's clinging to the hillside with a path going down to the left and a rather annoying white car at what would be the bottom of the frame of my photograph. As I've been just wandering down this little slope here, I've been asking myself the question, should I or shan't I take the photograph? And again, I think that's a really important question that we need to ask ourselves in photography. I think in this digital age, we can all be drawn into thinking, oh, I'll just take it anyway and see what it comes out like. But I think if we can make our decisions out in the field, it makes our decisions afterwards in terms of when we're post-producing and editing our photographs much easier. Because if we can see something out in the field and think, excuse me, I've just got something landing on my finger, you can think, actually, I don't know if that is going to work. Because the sun's gone in now, so the sun is on the mountains at the back rather than where I'd rightly, spit your words out, Tom, prefer it to be on the house in the middle of the frame, which is currently being shaded by the trees. And, oh, wait a minute, what's happening now? The sun's coming back out, but it's still in shade as the house. So it's on the foreground and on the background, but not on the house in the middle. And that's sort of helping me to make the decision that actually now the sun is coming onto the house and the shade's moving onto the trees behind. I might give it a go. Again, I'm eating my words. I'm doing things that I say you shouldn't do and then doing them myself. You know what? I didn't take it. I'm sticking to my guns. I think light plays such an important role in photography. Many people sort of forget about it and place more emphasis on subject matter and compositional tools like leading lines and the rule of thirds. And they think that that's going to salvage their shot, even if the light's not great. But because light is so important in photography, it doesn't matter all of that paraphernalia that you throw at your photographs to try and save them. Apologies for the motorbike roaring in the background. Then you just get lost by trying to make something good when actually in reality it's probably not that great. And that feeling of compromise that I'm trying to get at whilst you're out in the field by reading the light, understanding what's going to be illuminated in your shot if you're lucky to have the light there. And if you haven't got the light there, trying to be canny and look for different contrast points in maybe colours or different tonalities of different trees or whatever it is that you're photographing, then you're going to make better decisions whilst you're out in the field. And yes, you might take fewer shots. You think, oh, I'm taking fewer shots, so therefore my hit rate's going to go down. But actually, I think it's going to go up because you're making better decisions whilst you're out and about and not ferreting and fannying around with these pointless tools that are going to maybe flower your photographs up a bit, but not make them as good as you could get them if you choose the right thing to photograph in the right light. And again, I think it's really important to stress that there's no such thing as bad light in photography, just bad choices when you're making photographs. So yeah, I'm going to ignore that house, as pretty as it is to the eye, just like that waterfall was earlier on. I'm going to move on and photograph something that I think is going to work better as a photograph. And I tell you what, my arm is really aching doing this videoing, but hopefully you're watching it and you're finding it beneficial seeing me rather than just listening to me rabbit on as per usual. I'm going to give my arm a rest now. That's better. I do hope you can hear those cowbells in the background. There's something really quite beautiful about that sound, I always think. I've been to the Alps quite a few times before, and every time I come it just brings me straight back. Well, obviously I'm here, so I'm back already, but you know what I mean. Anyway, I've just taken another shot. I didn't record whilst I was taking it because it was at a farm and there were some French farmers around. And if they're anything like Yorkshire farmers, then they might not take kindly to some bloke talking to himself whilst taking pictures. So I took the shot anyway, which you can see on the show notes page, or if you're watching on YouTube, it will be on screen now, miraculously, through the magic of podcasting. It was a farm building with the lake and trees in the background. And on the door of this little barn, there was a little Hessian bag hanging up. And it was sort of lit up in the foreground. I don't think lit up's the right term really, but I'll use it anyway. You're looking at the picture now, so you can come up with your own adjective for it. But it was basically lit by these yellow flowers, which I thought gave some nice foreground interest. And then I had the layer of the barn with the interest of the bag, and then the layer of the lake in the background with the trees. And I just thought it summed up what I was trying to get out of the shot, really, and summed up another little interesting aside on my walk today. Framing the landscape in its grand terms, but not trying to get absolutely every bit of the landscape in, just bringing a bit of context to the surroundings where I am, and as I said earlier on, the things that are leading my eye that I find interesting to photograph. This could very much be another interesting little photograph. The view framed by a house in its typical alpine style, more of these wild flowers that are banking the footpath, and then the mountains with the snow on in the background. I think what I'll do with this shot is go portrait, because I want to get an even split between the layers of the wildflowers, then the little cabin, and then the lake and the mountains and the trees beyond. I think when you're framing up any shot, thinking about layers is really important, and thinking how is your eye going to get from one of these layers to the next, and how are they going to provide depth as well in your photograph to make it look like your eye is lingering for longer and making its way through the photograph rather than just looking at a specific subject. Excuse me, there's a dumper truck coming, so I'm going to have to stop recording, but I'll record again when it's past me. Now, I'm sure it's just me, but I'm sure when people pass me they think, strange Englishman talking to himself whilst holding his phone up with a fluffy thing on his chest. Anyway, back to this photograph that I was taking before the dumper truck rudely interrupted me. I think with this shot there is this fence in the foreground, and many people will think, well, it's a bit distracting, it's a bit ugly, why are you taking a photograph with that in it? The reason why is because it's there, and to be honest, I don't think it is ugly. I think it just adds context to the scene. Sometimes we aim for perfection too much, I feel, and ignore the feeling that we have when we make a photograph and the context of what's there when we make it. And I think by eradicating some of those things sometimes plays a detriment to our photographs rather than being a beneficial thing. Yes, it might look ugly in terms of you're trying to enter a photograph into a competition and competition judges don't like things like that. Or it might look ugly in the fact that somebody told me that you shouldn't include things that look ugly in your photographs because that's just ridiculous. But I'm going to tell you different. I think sometimes just bringing things into the shot that are there doesn't necessarily pay detriment to the photograph because it's there. It's another little bit of a leading line. It adds a bit more depth to the shot. And yeah, I'm leaving it in. So, yeah. Oh, it's getting warm now. I'm leaving the lake behind me in the valley below, and I'm making my way up into the woods and the mountains to go in search of more interesting shots. And just coming up on my, wait a minute, which side is it? I'm not that good with directions because I'm terribly dyslexic. It's on my right hand side is that barn that I dismissed taking a photograph earlier on because it wasn't in the sun and it was just getting lost in the greenery. But look at it now in the state of the mountains. If you're listening to the podcast, obviously you can't look at it now because you're not looking at it. But believe you me, if you are listening to the podcast, then it's shining so much better here with a much more interesting backdrop. So again, it goes to show that sometimes it pays to wait for the shot and not rush into it straight away. And although that there is a slightly annoying telegraph pole in there, maybe that might have the effect of framing the cabin or the barn a little bit more in the view, to channel your eye down to it, but also channel your eye up towards the mountains beyond as well. So I'm going to give it a go, see what it comes out like. You can see it on the show notes page at yorkshirephotowalks.com/podcasts, or see it on screen on YouTube. Blimey, I'm getting out of breath here. This alpine air is getting to me. No, Tom, ignore the vanishing track. If you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know that I've got a thing for the vanishing track. I think it acts as a brilliant leading line, even though I don't tend to like following the rules of composition. But I also think vanishing points just add so much wonderful intrigue to the photograph that you're taking. And I think this shot in front of me here is going to work perfectly on that front. I've got this track bending round from right to left. No, it's left to right again. I'm not good with my directions. And it's leading up to the tree-clad mountains with the snow-clad mountains in the background with different layers of light on it. And I think a shot like this will work, but I also think it might work well in black and white. The reason I say shots like that would probably work best in black and white is just purely down to the contrast layers within the photograph. I think when you've got those varying layers of contrast, then black and white just lifts them and draws your eye to them, rather than thinking, oh, that's green, oh, that's green, oh, that's green. And it just makes the photograph pop more. And if you can bring more contrast and a bit more sharpness into those layers, then it's always going to be absolutely fantastic for your photographs, I always think. I know what people are thinking now. I'm thinking, oh, he's going on about that black and white thing again. And, oh, he's going on about that layering thing again. But all of these things do help to think about. Wow, that view behind's stunning now. Whoops, nearly dropped my camera. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record again, but I've just come to this point where I've got this absolutely spectacular view in front of me with the farm buildings, the track disappearing off, the lake, the mountains, the little mountain hut where you can buy a pint, which I'll be sorely tempted to do when I finish this walk. But again, it's one of those photographs that I just don't think it's going to work. There's not a clear focal point that's jumping out and saying, look at me. It's just all a mismatch of various different focal points that don't really stand out enough for me. So I'm just going to pause here, get my breath back, admire the view with my eyes, but I'm not going to take a picture of it. He says, videoing it profusely with his phone. Ah, this shade's nice. So peaceful in here, apart from all the twittering birds and the raging waterfall below, but that means peace, doesn't it? I mean, it's not very peoply. Again, I'm making up words, which if you've listened to this podcast before, you'll know that I make up a new one every episode. Just as I'm walking through the trees here, it's just popped into my head. Again, talking about popping again, apologies. But one of the most frequent questions I get asked, whether it's on my photo walks or in general, is what do you focus on when you're making a photograph? And I often think, well, surely that's an obvious question to answer. Your subject is what you focus on. But a little bit like the photograph that we've just taken of the vanishing track, there isn't really a clear focal point there. It's just the vanishing point. So I suppose with a photograph like that, what I'll do is I'll just focus on the point at which the path disappears, because ultimately where you focus is where people's eye is going to be led to the most. So if you think about that when you are focusing your shot, then that's not a bad way to go about it. What I usually do is use single point focus. So I'm not doing like a random area. I know exactly where he's going to be in focus in my shot. So therefore, when I do focus it, and I focus it either on my subject or exactly where I want people to look, then I know that it's going to be in focus and people are going to look there. So I suppose that's my long-winded way of saying that focus where you want people to look, and that should work. This landscape just keeps getting more and more impressive the further on I go up this track. Having said that, the photograph that I've just taken is another aside shot. I've just come across this barn behind me, which I always like seeing little bits of human inhabitation in an otherwise very wild landscape. And I just get drawn to things like this. Excuse me whilst I slap my ankle because something's trying to bite me. I always say that if my ankle was a restaurant, it would have a Michelin star because it tends to get nibbled on quite a lot by little critters. And I haven't put any insect repellent on today. But anyway, less of my problems, more on the photography. So the shot that I'm going for here is this little window, which is boarded up behind. And behind the window and the little apex of the barn, there's a little log store on the horizon in the trees behind. And again, looking at those layers, I really like the way that this not only provides a bit of context of where I'm photographing and the landscape, it's sort of a different view in terms of the culture of where I am. It's very alpine. You wouldn't see this in the Yorkshire Dales, for example. And I just like the way that the lines interact, the diagonals, the lines lead you through the layers and make your eye linger on the shot a little bit longer than if everything was straight or everything was just flat and on top of each other. Again, it's not a vast landscape shot. I'm just admiring that with my eyes as per usual at the moment, but it is a shot that has drawn my eye and I think looks reasonably interesting and adds another little chapter to my view of my walk today. You'll be pleased to know I've just doused myself in insect repellent, mainly due to the fact that these little blighters look even more menacing than the Yorkshire horseflies do, which is saying something. I've just paused by this little stream. Apologies if it's making you need the toilet, but I've just seen a shot that I think might work. It's not the sort of shot that I would usually go for because it doesn't really have a clear focal point or even a vanishing point for that matter. But to be honest, I'm just being drawn by the light again. I'm facing this meadow area with buttercups waving in the breeze in front of me, what little breeze there is. And behind it there's a cliff face just clad in conifer trees that's been licked by the sun. Some of them in shade, some of them lit on a sort of diagonal path. So I'm going to take the shot and see what it comes out like. You can be the judge of whether you think it works or not on the show notes page or on YouTube. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I'm being drawn in by another vanishing track. I think this one's going to have to be a photograph because it's just neatly twisting away towards the mountains beyond, leading your eye exactly where I would want it to be led to. And it is such an impressive scene, although it is that big vista, that grand landscape. I think this is one of those shots that whether it's golden hour or winter or autumn or summer or spring, let's mention all the seasons, why not? Then I just think it's going to work. Now, I usually like to have a theme running through these podcasts, and I suppose today it's all about compromise and making choices, and the right choices whilst you're out in the field. And the thing that's reminding me of that are these big rocks that I'm just walking through at the moment. There's 3 of them all together that are lining the side of the path, and they're absolutely huge. They're just boulders that must have just been dumped here by a glacier at some point. And a lot of people will come across something like this and think, that's absolutely incredible. How interesting, these rocks just lining the path here. I must photograph them. And yes, they'd be all right to take a record shot of, what I'd call just like a holiday snap. But if you're really wanting to pursue photography in strong earnest, let's say, then sometimes it's things like this that actually probably don't make good photographs unless you have something else in the shot with them. I think just on their own, it's just a rock. What's interesting about that? You're here, well, you're not here, I'm here, but if you were putting yourself in my shoes, then you're here to experience everything else that's going on around you, the fantastic landscape, the sounds, the smells, the grand nature of absolutely everything that's accosting your senses. And the people that look at your photographs aren't. They're just seeing what you've captured in a rectangular or square or however you want to crop your photograph down to frame. And they're looking at this 2-dimensional view that, as we've been trying to do in this podcast today, put a bit more depth into it. So sometimes you've just got to put yourself in other people's shoes and think, well, actually, how can I translate what I'm experiencing as best as I can into the photographs that I'm making? Which I suppose is why these rocks, as grand as they are, work far much more constructively. God, that's difficult to say. Constructively in a photograph like the one that we've just taken, within the grand vista, playing a part in the composition rather than being the main focal point. Because like I'm just looking at here, the rock, which is echoing my voice actually, with the mountain behind it, you might think, oh, it's absolutely perfectly framed as that. I've got my line of the path which is leading down to it. I've got the mountain behind, I've got the rock. Oh, this is fantastic. But I guarantee, looking at this as a photograph, it would just look flat and it wouldn't do the rock justice at all. So making sure that you make those compromises whilst out in the field and think, actually, how am I going to draw people's eye around this photograph? And not necessarily think, oh, this is a really impressive rock, let's just take a snap of it. Because in years to come, you'll look back at the picture and think, why on earth did I take that? Whereas if you photograph the rock in context with the rest of the landscape, you think, oh wow, I remember those rocks, they were huge. So it just comes to the point where you've just got to think, actually, I've got to photograph the landscape as I see it and how I want other people to see it as well, rather than just going all the time for those shots of things that look impressive to the eye and are nice to experience at the time whilst you're there, but don't necessarily make good photographs. You know, I've never been this close to bathing in a cow's trough before, but I must admit this sun is absolutely sweltering. And as I climb, it's just getting warmer, or at least I'm getting warmer and warmer. I'm sure the temperature outside is just staying the same. It's just my body coping with the conditions. But the surroundings are just absolutely idyllic. The meadows, the mountains, the view down the valley. It's just all so spectacular, and I just feel very privileged to be here, and I'm glad I can share it with you as well. It must be getting warm. I'm getting all sentimental. I think I'm going to venture a little bit further up this path. I don't want to get too high because I'm on my own and I'm using my phone to film this, and I don't want the battery to die before I get back to my car. So I'm going to carry on a little bit further, see if there's anything else that catches my eye to photograph. probably eat my tuna and avocado sandwich as well, which is now burning a hole in my bag as I use all the energy up from my breakfast. And then I'll probably head back down the hill. But I'm sure there's probably a few more photographs to come yet, so don't give up on this podcast just yet. At least, that is, if you haven't done so already. You can't beat a shed. And in this setting, it's just even better. I think this is as high as I'm going to go. The snow on the mountains behind is almost touchable now. But yeah, it's absolutely sweltering still, although I'm benefiting from a nice cooling breeze. I'm going to see if I can get a shot of this little shed. As I say, if there's two things in life I can't resist, it's a vanishing path and a shed. So let's see what I can come up with. Then I'll have my lunch and I'll head back down. There are a few photographs that I sort of forego on the way up that I think I might give a go to on the way down, so stay tuned for those. But first of all, the pièce de résistance, getting into the French. Let's go and have a look at this shed. I suppose the question is how you get to it the best, because it's surrounded in all of these boulders and also these long grasses and wildflowers, which I know for a fact there's going to be plenty of insects there to feast on my ankles. So I'm just going to walk around the back, I think, and see if I can get an angle on it. The thing is, the sun is hitting it from this side where I'm walking towards it now, and ideally the view is probably better behind it the other way, but I'll see what I can get. Never give up on a shed. That's another one of my famous mantras. Actually, that view there now is not half bad at all. The tree behind is a little bit annoying because that's what the eye is going to be led to. So maybe if I move across a little bit further, then we might be able to get rid of that tree behind the shed and have more of the valley behind it. I'll have a go at that and see what I can come up with. There we go. I've taken 2 photographs of the shed. I'll share those with you on YouTube now, or if you're looking at the show notes page, you'll be able to see them there. I think this goes to reiterate my point that I was making about light, because just as I was about to photograph the shed, the light went, the sun went in behind the cloud and everything just flattened down. And then I was just about to leave and say, look at me, I'm not very patient. What sort of photographer am I? And then the sun came out again just as I was about to leave the shed behind. So I came back and took another shot. And I'm glad I did, because I think the one in the sun just looks so much better. It lifts the shed, it pulls it forward in the photograph and makes you look at it more, and it just works so much better, I think. So thank you, shed, and thank you, sun. I'm going to wade my way back through these flowers and things now. The one good thing about here is no nettles. If I was walking through the Yorkshire countryside now, I'd be knee deep in them, if not neck deep. But thankfully here they don't seem to have them, which is quite pleasant. Just the nibbly little blighters instead. On the way up this path, I was looking at these beautiful wildflowers that are on either side and thinking, I must get a shot of those, but it's really difficult to get because A, there isn't really much of an interesting background. Those of you watching on YouTube and looking at what you can see now on screen, you're thinking, Tom, that looks quite impressive to me. But like we've said already, as soon as you put a focal point in front of something, it just flattens things down a bit, and you need a bit more oomph to draw the eye through the photograph and to create that feeling of depth. But as I've been walking down, I've found these little ridges where the wildflowers seem to be a bit more prominent. So I'm thinking if I can get down low and get the wildflowers almost surrounding my camera, so it feels like as you look at the photograph, you're almost lying down in the meadow itself, and just utilise the contrasting light and shade in the background with the impressive view behind, it might be a little bit more interesting than if I just shot the winding track. Listen to me, I'm giving up a disappearing, vanishing path. in pursuit of wildflowers. What's going wrong with me? This alpine air must be affecting me more than I thought. But I think that's what I'm going to try and do. If it works, then I'll show you on the show notes page. If it doesn't work, I'll also show you, because I'm not afraid of accepting my faults as a photographer, because sometimes photographs work and other times they don't, and that is one of the joys of photography. It's got to the point where the sun is so reflective on my camera screen, and from the sun cream, insect repellent and sweat, it's very difficult to see through the clouded mork of my camera. So I'll let you be a judge of whether that shot worked. I was trying to use my little flip out screen, which are usually very handy, but when you can't see anything in the first place through it, then it does become a little bit more challenging. But I think it should have worked. I tried to project the flowers up in front of a rock and then have them, again like the orchid earlier on, just sheltered over the shade in the valley below, to pull them forward in the photograph. So it's time to make my way back down this track now. If I do see any more wildflowers that I think actually that's a better promontory than I've just spotted, then I'll give those a go as well. But I think where I was, because the path is in a little bit of a tiered structure here, I think that's probably going to be the best angle I could have got. The other angle that I could have done, of course, is looking back up at them, but as I was walking up the hill, I thought, well, actually that's not going to work, because everything behind it is just green of grass. And really, with the wildflowers, you need the shadow of the mountains behind just to make them pop and stand out a bit more. And depth of field tends to be a lot shallower if you've got more distance between your subject and its background as well. So that'll soften the background a bit more, rather than it just looking a bit of a mess with lots of flowers and grass piled on top of each other. I'm walking through those big boulders again on my way back down the hill. I think one of the best types of walk that you can do as a photographer, wherever you are in the world, is an out and back walk. Many people malign the out and back walk because they think, well, that's boring. Surely you want to go round in a circle and see as much as you possibly can. But I think approaching things from two different perspectives, going out one way and back the other, can really spice up your photographs, and you'll see things that you didn't see on the way up. A little bit like the flowers that we've just been photographing. If I'd have photographed them on the way up, then I probably wouldn't have been able to get the angle that I wanted on them, whereas photographing on them on the way down, spit your words out again, Tom, then it seemed to work much better. And as I'm walking down here, I'm just enjoying the same walk as I walked up, but from a completely different vantage point. And I'm sure as I do walk down, then more photos may pop out, to use that favourite phrase of mine of the day, once more. In fact, there might be something there. Hang on a minute. We've got the barn that I photographed earlier, or at least a proportion of it, but we've also got more wildflowers in the foreground. What I might try here is getting up close and personal with these wildflowers, see if I can frame the barn in the background. It is a bit far away, but by getting close to these flowers, then hopefully it might provide a bit of background context. I'm not bothered about the sky because it's a bit flat up there, so I'm just going to isolate the barn and see, as I say, if I can frame it with those wildflowers. Again, I'll let you be the judge of whether that's worked or not. What I tried to do there was purposefully avoid the oxeye daisies, because I think having a bright white out of focus blob in the foreground of your photograph might not be the most appealing thing in the world, whereas sometimes out of focus other colour blobs can just draw your eye through. I think if you had everything in focus there, then your eye would have been a bit confused about where to look. Whereas utilising the barn as the focal point, putting that in focus and having the wildflowers out of focus, you know what they are because they're out of focus colour blobs that look like wildflowers. So there's no mistaking that. They just act as a bit of foreground interest to layer that photograph up again and slow your eye down as it looks through towards the barn in the distance. As I say, it might work, it might not. I'm out in the field and I'm just enjoying myself at the moment. Look at that view again behind me if you're watching on YouTube. If you're not, then make sure you check out these podcasts on YouTube now, because you can see them as well as listen to them. Just search Yorkshire Photo Walks on YouTube, you'll get there, and make sure that you subscribe for not just these podcasts but also my other videos as well that are more tutorial, well, not more tutorial in nature. In fact, I think these are probably more tutorial in nature, but these are a bit more spontaneous, let's say. This path looks a bit dicey. Maybe I should be concentrating more on where I'm putting my feet rather than trying to record as I do so, because it's getting slippier and slippier. I've just had another view of that waterfall through the trees, and again, it's absolutely beautiful to look at, but because of the busy nature of the woodland, then I'm just not going to bother. Anyway, let's see if we can get down this path in one piece. You didn't think I was going to avoid the waterfall altogether, did you? When you are out and about taking photographs, it pays to look around. Sometimes you might not be able to find the viewpoint that you want from the path that you're on, but if you deviate a little bit from the route, then you might just find something like the view that I've got behind me here. I'm going to have another little wander round. I don't really want to drop my recording equipment into the river and lose it in the lake because it swims down below. But I'm going to have a look and see if I can get a decent angle on this waterfall once and for all. Oh, I've been shouting over the waterfall, and the power of the alpine air, I think I'm losing my voice. So I suppose I ought to just shut up and get a photograph. There we go. I think that's probably the best angle that I'm going to get on this. I think with waterfalls, it's really difficult to get that sense of depth, because they're often just coming down in a straight line and cascading your eye through the photograph as it follows the water quite rapidly. Yes, you can slow the movement of the water down if you want to, but again, that's one of those Marmite things in photography. Some people love it, some people hate it. Again, I think that works differently in different seasons. Sometimes smoother water looks better in winter and faster water looks better in summer. But again, it's a choice that you can only make yourself. I've made it back down to the banks of the lake. It really has been an absolutely spectacular walk. I've enjoyed every single step, and I'd like to say I've enjoyed every single photograph as well. Let's just hope that I've done this landscape justice with the pictures that I've taken. I seem to have covered quite a lot on this podcast, so I suppose I ought to try and summarise it the best I can. I suppose the take-home points that I'd like to stress really from what we've discussed and what we've seen and discovered on this walk today. First of all, photography is all about compromise. We have to ask ourselves, what do we want from our photographs? If we're looking for those pristine landscape shots where the light's perfect and absolutely everything with the composition is spot on, then ideally don't come out on a day like I have done today with bright sunshine, because it's just not going to work. But alternatively, if you are out on a day like today, enjoying your holiday like I am, it doesn't mean that you can't take good photographs. You've just got to look at where you're photographing in slightly different light and use that light, that's the second point, to compose your shots. Don't just necessarily go on subject matter and titivating things with composition all the time and walloping the bejeebers off your photographs in post-production afterwards. Rely on that light and choose your subject matter based on the light rather than the other way around. Also, in terms of compromise, it's about selecting what you want people to look at, whether that's through depth of field, where you focus, or how you align your composition. Just make sure that what you want people to look at is the highlight of the frame, because if it isn't, then it's just going to be a bit boring and people are going to get a bit lost. and make sure that the photographs that you take mean something to you, but also mean something to the people that are potentially going to look at them as well. Photograph things in context so they don't confuse people, and make sure that people get a grasp of what it is that you're trying to photograph, rather than just taking those record snapshots all the time. To be honest, I've probably covered far much more than that, and it's been such a long episode that I can't remember. So you can either catch up by listening to it all again, or head over to the show notes page at yorkshirephotowalks.com/podcasts, where you can see all of the photographs that I've taken in this episode and catch up on previous episodes as well. At the end of the day, I think it all comes down to enjoyment, getting out there and exploring with your camera. It doesn't necessarily matter if you're getting photographs, whether you're getting good photographs or bad photographs. It all comes down to that experience and coming out to miraculous places like this to enjoy some photography time. I do hope you've enjoyed listening or watching this podcast as much as I've enjoyed recording it, popping out in all of the right places and potentially some dodgy ones as well. If you have, then if you're watching on YouTube, then please give this video a like and share with me your comments in the comments section below. Don't worry if your opinions differ to mine that I've shared in this podcast. It just means that we're enjoying photography from two different perspectives. It doesn't mean that one of us is right and the other's wrong. So I'd love to hear your stories about your enjoyment of photography, and maybe some of your little frustrations that you come across as well. If you're listening to this podcast on another platform, then please leave me a positive review, and whatever you can do to help the progression and get this podcast out to more ears. It's all good work. Now, at the end of this track, there's a little hut selling beer that has my name written all over it. So I'm going to go back and enjoy a bit of après-ski. I suppose they don't call it that in the summer, do they? Nobody's skiing, we're all hiking. Anyway, whatever they call it, that's what I'm going to enjoy. Until the next episode, when I'm sure my feet will be well and truly planted back on Yorkshire soil in the wind, rain and cold, I will see you in the next episode. Until then, thank you very much for watching. Au revoir for now. The Yorkshire Photo Walks podcast is filmed and edited by Tom Marsh, the flat-capped photographer, and it's brought to you by Yorkshire Photo Walks, providing expert photography tuition and experiences to all levels of photographer on short walks through unique and inspirational Yorkshire locations. Don't just photograph Yorkshire, experience it with Yorkshire Photo Walks.